Here's a fact that catches people off guard. NIST has no regulatory power whatsoever. It cannot fine you, audit you, or force you to do anything. It's a measurement laboratory that was originally set up to standardize weights and measures. And yet, its cybersecurity framework is used by tens of thousands of organizations across more than a dozen translated languages, and it's written into contracts and regulations that NIST never authored. So let me ask you, how does a voluntary document from a non-regulator become the thing everyone builds to? That's not an accident, that's a deliberate method, and understanding it tells you a lot about how to use the AI RMF properly. In this chapter, we'll answer that. You'll learn who NIST actually is and why its opinion carries weight, how it builds standards through open consultation rather than decree, and what its earlier frameworks teach us about this one. We'll cover where the AI RMF came from, what Congress asked for, what the framework is actually trying to achieve, and crucially, what it is not. Because here's the trap I see constantly. Teams treat the AI RMF like a compliance checklist, tick the boxes, and wonder why nothing improved. It was never designed for that. By the end of this chapter, you'll know exactly what tool you're holding and how it's meant to be used. Let's get into it. So who is NIST? The National Institute of Standards and Technology. It sits inside the US Department of Commerce, and it's been around since 1901, back when it was called the National Bureau of Standards. Its original job was beautifully unglamorous: measurement. If you buy a kilogram of something in Boston and a kilogram in Seattle, is it the same kilogram? Somebody has to be the reference. That was NIST. And here's the thing, they still do that. NIST maintains atomic clocks that define official time. They define units. They're a laboratory first and a policy body second, and I think that's the key to understanding them. So why does a measurement lab write risk frameworks? Because measurement is trust infrastructure. Commerce only works if people can agree on what things are. And as technology became the economy, that question moved from kilograms to cybersecurity to now artificial intelligence. Notice what's absent though. NIST is not a regulator. They have no enforcement arm. They cannot fine you. So why does anyone listen? Because they've built a century of credibility as a neutral, technically rigorous body with no agenda to sell you. When NIST says something is good practice, industry believes it's actually good practice rather than a political compromise. That reputation is the whole asset. Now here's what I find genuinely admirable about how NIST works, and it explains why their documents feel usable rather than theoretical. They don't write standards, they convene them. Let me show you what that means in practice. For the AI RMF, NIST issued a public request for information. Then they held workshops, open to anyone, with industry, academia, civil society and government all in the same room. They published a concept paper, then a first draft, then a second draft, public comment at every stage, and hundreds of organizations responded. Then they published the comments and showed how they'd responded. Compare that to how a regulation typically appears. A body drafts it, a short consultation happens, and it lands. So why does this matter to you? Two reasons. First, quality. When practitioners who actually run AI systems shape the document works in the real world. Second, buy-in. People adopt what they helped build. That's why you'll find engineers at large technology firms who genuinely respect the AI RMF, which is not something you often hear about compliance documents. There's a trade-off, of course. Consensus takes time and it produces language that's sometimes carefully general. But it buys you legitimacy, and legitimacy is what makes voluntary frameworks actually get used. So the AI RMF didn't appear from nowhere. NIST has a lineage here, and knowing it helps you predict how this one behaves. Start with the NIST Risk Management Framework, the RMF, from Special Publication 800-37. Built for federal information systems, very structured, 6 steps, tied to a big catalog of controls in 800-53. mandatory for federal agencies, prescriptive and thorough. Then, in 2014, something different, the cybersecurity framework, voluntary, outcome based, 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. No control catalog, no certification, just a structure for organizing the conversation. And it exploded. It got adopted across critical infrastructure, then across industries that had no obligation whatsoever, then internationally. Regulators started referencing it, contracts started requiring it. A voluntary document became a de facto expectation. Then the privacy framework in 2020 using the same pattern. So look at the AI RMF now and you'll see the family resemblance immediately. Voluntary, outcome based, function structured, govern, map, measure, manage. Here's the lesson I draw for you. Watch what happened to the cybersecurity framework. Voluntary at first, then the market made it mandatory in practice. Don't be surprised when the same thing happens here. It's already starting. So let's talk about why NIST standards travel, because this is the thing that determines whether the framework you're studying actually matters. Think about it from a buyer's perspective. You're a large enterprise procuring an AI system from a vendor. You need some way to ask, are you managing this responsibly? You can't audit their data science team. So you reach for a shared reference point. And the reference point that everyone recognizes, that no vendor can claim is biased against them, is NIST. That's how these things spread, not by mandate, by contract. One large buyer puts it in their vendor requirements, and suddenly 200 suppliers are implementing it. Then insurers pick it up. Then regulators start citing it as evidence of reasonable practice. Then courts start treating it as the standard of care. That's the quiet path from voluntary to expected. I saw this exact sequence with the cybersecurity framework. Within about 5 years, it went from an interesting document to something you simply had to be able to speak about in any enterprise sales conversation. And it's happening now with the AI RMF. Vendor questionnaires reference it, executive orders reference it, crosswalks to the EU AI Act reference it. So, the practical point: learning this framework isn't academic, it's becoming the vocabulary of the market. So, where did this framework actually come from? There's a specific origin, and it's worth knowing. Congress. The National AI Initiative Act of 2020 directed NIST to develop a voluntary risk management framework for trustworthy AI systems. Notice the word voluntary was in the instruction itself. That wasn't NIST's choice, it was the mandate. So NIST began in 2021, Request for Information First, which drew responses from technology companies, banks, hospitals, civil society groups, academics. Then a series of open workshops. Then a concept paper in late 2021. Then draft 1 in March 2022. Then draft 2 in August. Hundreds of comments at each stage, all published. And in January 2023, AI RMF 1.0 was released, alongside a companion playbook with practical suggestions. Now here's a detail I love. Look at the timing. This was finalized in January 2023. ChatGPT had launched roughly 6 weeks earlier, so the framework was designed before the generative AI wave truly broke. Did that make it obsolete? Remarkably, no. And that's the strongest evidence for its design. Because it focused on outcomes rather than technologies, it stretched to cover something its authors hadn't fully seen coming. NIST later added a generative AI profile rather than rewriting the core. That's what good architecture looks like. So what is this framework actually trying to achieve? Let's be precise, because the stated goal shapes everything. NIST's own framing is this: to help organizations manage risks to individuals, organizations, and society associated with AI, and to promote the development of trustworthy and responsible AI. Now read that again and notice the order: individuals, organizations, society. Individuals came first. That's not accidental. Most enterprise risk frameworks start and end with harm to the organization. This one deliberately widens the lens. Let me break down what that means practically. Under a traditional risk lens, a biased hiring model is only a risk if it creates legal exposure or reputational damage to you. Under this lens, the harm to the candidate who didn't get the interview counts in its own right. And here's the second goal which people miss: promote the development of trustworthy AI. It's not just defensive. NIST explicitly wanted this to enable innovation, not suppress it. Their view, and I share it, is that trust is what unlocks adoption. Nobody deploys AI at scale into a domain they don't trust. So the framework has two faces: protect people from AI and protect AI from the loss of trust that would stop it being used at all. Hold both. Alright, let's address this directly because it's the single most misunderstood point about the AI RMF. It's voluntary. Nobody is going to audit you against it. There is no NIST certificate. You cannot be found non-compliant because there's nothing to comply with. Now, when I say that in a room, I usually see two reactions. Some people relax, others deflate and ask, so why bother? Let's take that question seriously. Why bother? Because voluntary is a feature, not a weakness. Think about what a regulation must do. It must be specific enough to enforce, which means it freezes at a moment in time. The EU AI Act took years to negotiate. AI moved considerably in those years. A voluntary framework can be flexible. It can say, assess your risk in context rather than run these 7 tests because it doesn't need to be litigable. And here's the practical reality: voluntary in law is rarely voluntary in the market. Your customers ask, your insurers ask, regulators cite it as evidence of reasonable care. So, my honest advice: don't ask whether you have to, ask whether it makes you better. Because that's the question NIST designed it to answer, and it's the more useful question anyway. So, who is this framework for? The answer is broader than most people assume, and that breadth is intentional. NIST talks about AI actors, not just developers, anyone who plays a role across the AI lifecycle. So that includes the data scientist building the model, yes, but also the business owner who decided to buy it, the procurement team writing the contract, the lawyer assessing exposure, the operator using the output, the auditor checking it afterwards, even the affected individual, in the sense that their perspective must be represented. And organizationally, any size, any sector, whether you build AI or just buy it. That last point deserves emphasis. I'd say the majority of organizations I work with don't build a single model. They buy tools with AI inside them, and they often assume the framework doesn't apply to them because they're not developers. Let me push back on that. If you deploy someone else's model to make decisions about your customers, whose risk is that? Yours. The regulator will not accept the vendor built it as an answer. Neither will the customer whose loan you declined. So if you're a buyer, this framework applies fully. Your map function looks different, your measure function relies more on vendor evidence, but the accountability is identical. Don't outsource that. So how does the AI RMF sit alongside NIST's other work? Because you probably already have some of it in place, and I don't want you building a parallel universe. Start with the cybersecurity framework. There's genuine overlap. Your AI system is a system. It needs access control, monitoring, incident response, supply chain security. All of that is CSF territory, and it applies unchanged. But the AI RMF adds what CSF doesn't cover: bias, explainability, model drift, fairness. Your firewall doesn't care whether the model discriminates. Then the privacy framework, also overlapping. AI systems consume personal data and the privacy risks are real, but AI adds new ones. Inference of sensitive attributes you never collected, memorization and regurgitation of training data. Then the secure software development framework, which NIST extended for AI. Now here's the design point. NIST built these to be complementary, deliberately using similar structures and vocabulary so they'd interlock. Same function-based logic, same voluntary outcome-based philosophy. So the practical advice I'd give you: don't build a separate AI governance tower next to your existing risk function. Extend what you have. Your CSF work is a foundation, not a competitor. Add the AI-specific layer on top of it. So let's talk about where this is going, because the framework is not standing still and you should know that. AI RMF 1.0 landed in January 2023. Notice that version number, 1.0. NIST said explicitly from day one that this was intended to be a living document, reviewed and revised as the technology and the practice evolved. And they've been true to that. In July 2024, they published the Generative AI Profile, NIST AI 600-1, which addresses risks specific to generative systems, confabulation, prompt injection, harmful content generation. Notice what they did there. They didn't rewrite the core, they added a profile. That's the architecture working exactly as designed. Since then, more profiles and companion work have followed, and there's an active process around revising the framework with attention to agentic systems, which are the current frontier. So, what does this mean for you practically? Two things. First, don't treat what you learn as permanent scripture. Check the source. NIST publishes everything openly on their AI Resource Center. Second, and more importantly, notice what doesn't change: the four functions, the trustworthy characteristics, the socio-technical view. Those are stable because they're about how to think, not what to do. Learn those deeply, and the profiles are just detail. So let's gather up what matters from this chapter. First, NIST's authority is earned, not granted. No enforcement power, a century of technical credibility, and an open consensus process. That's why the market trusts the output. And it's why you should read this framework as advice from a respected practitioner, not as a rule book from a regulator. Second, watch the cybersecurity framework precedent carefully. Voluntary became expected through contracts, insurance, and regulatory citation. That path is already visible for the AI RMF. So the question isn't whether this becomes market standard, it's whether you're ready when it does. Third, voluntary is a design choice that buys flexibility. It can say, assess in context precisely because it never has to be litigated. Use that flexibility rather than resenting the absence of a checklist. And fourth, the framework applies to you even if you build nothing. Buying AI doesn't outsource accountability. Now, if you want a detailed, structured course on this topic with role plays, quizzes, and practice tests, our Udemy course link is in the description. Do subscribe to the channel if you're finding this useful. And the YouTube playlist link is in the description too, which will give you the complete ordered list of every video in this series. Next up, we open the framework and look at how it's actually built. See you there.